Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a darker age. The torches are flickering. The cobblestones are wet. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls the hour, slowly, and perhaps a little too ominously for comfort. So, settle in. Pull up your blanket. We're going to talk about criminals, not the daring rogues of legend, but the very real, very unfortunate figures who haunted medieval Europe. Men and women who stole, swindled, poisoned, and betrayed their way into the chronicles of history. The Middle Ages loved to moralize about sin and virtue, but as it turns out, people were still very human. They cheated. They killed. They complained about taxes. And sometimes, if they were especially unlucky, they got caught. We'll start with a few who became infamous, not because they were particularly clever, but because their crimes said something about the world they lived in. Let's begin in 14th century France, where our first charming figure lurked, Gilles de Rais. Now, you may recognize that name, and not for pleasant reasons. Gilles was a French nobleman, a knight who fought bravely alongside Joan of Arc, a national hero, decorated in battle, admired by his peers. And then, well, he became something else entirely. He was born rich, powerful, and a little too imaginative for his own good. After the wars, Gilles retired to his estates and spent his fortune like a man determined to test the limits of bankruptcy. He built grand chapels, staged elaborate plays, and hired entire choirs to perform for him. But when the money ran out, he turned, quite literally, to darker appetites. I won't linger on the gruesome parts, this is bedtime history, after all, but suffice it to say, Gilles de Rais became one of the earliest known serial killers in European history. His confessions spoke of abduction, ritual, and horror. He was hanged and burned in 1440, and his fall from noble knight to condemned criminal remains one of the most chilling transformations in medieval record. It's tempting to imagine he was just a monster, an outlier. But in truth, Gilles was also a reflection of his class. Power without accountability, arrogance wrapped in piety, and the medieval tendency to confuse wealth with divine approval. Let's drift now across the Channel, to England, a little earlier, in the late 13th century, where we meet Eustace the monk. Eustace was complicated. He began as a Benedictine monk, though he wasn't particularly good at it. Monastic life didn't quite suit him, too many vows, not enough adventure. So, naturally, he left. And in a stunning display of career pivoting, became a pirate. Yes, a monk turned pirate. Because of course he did. Eustace terrorized the English Channel, raiding ships, ransoming captives, and occasionally working as a mercenary for whoever paid better, sometimes England, sometimes France. His legend grew until he was described as a sorcerer who could summon storms and vanish in smoke. Which, given medieval superstition, probably just meant he was very good at hiding in fog. He met his end in 1217, when his ship was captured during the Battle of Sandwich. Offered the chance to surrender, he reportedly refused and was promptly beheaded. His head was stuck on a ship's mast as a warning, though one suspects it probably just made him more famous. Even centuries later, sailors told stories about him. Not because they admired him, but because he represented something deliciously subversive, a monk who had simply decided that rules were optional. Now, while men like Gilles de Rais and Eustace made headlines, the medieval underworld was full of smaller, stranger criminals. There were professional beggars, organized into loose guilds who faked disabilities and crafted elaborate sob stories. City records from Paris, London, and Florence are filled with complaints about false cripples, limping dramatically until the constables turned a corner. There were church thieves, too, a risky trade, since stealing from a holy site was seen as stealing directly from God. Punishments ranged from branding to hanging. One chronicler noted, almost admiringly, that church thieves often had the lightest fingers and the shortest lives. And then there were the poisoners. The Middle Ages loved a good poisoning scandal. Especially among the noble classes, where subtle murder was practically a hobby. The most infamous was Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester. She was accused in 1441 of using witchcraft and potions to harm King Henry VI. Now, whether she actually poisoned anyone is debatable. Most likely, she was just unpopular and conveniently in the way. But the accusation was enough. Eleanor was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot through London, holding a candle, before being imprisoned for life. Her story wasn't unique. Poison became a catch-all accusation for everything from bad soup to political ambition. If a nobleman died suddenly, someone, somewhere, would always mutter about potions. Of course, crime wasn't just the domain of nobles. The medieval peasantry had its own rogues. Banditry was practically a profession. Forests teemed with outlaws, men driven from their lands by famine or war. Some became legends, like Robin Hood, whose story blurred the line between criminal and hero. Most, however, were just desperate people stealing bread or livestock. In England's royal records, you can find thousands of pardons issued to highway robbers who swore to serve the king in his wars. Crime and conscription often went hand in hand. Fight for your country, and we'll forget that sheep you stole. Let's drift for a moment into Italy, where the Renaissance was beginning to stir but the streets still belonged to thieves. In Florence, the Compagnia della Stella, the Company of the Star, operated as a kind of organized underworld fraternity. They robbed merchants, forged coins, and bribed officials. Even more amusingly, they developed their own slang and secret gestures. Think of it as a medieval mafia, but with more Latin and fewer guns. Florentine authorities tried to suppress them repeatedly, but the group simply rebranded itself every few years. One chronicler complained that to remove thieves from Florence is to remove the air itself. Meanwhile, in Germany, the roads were haunted by the robber knights. These were impoverished nobles who decided that chivalry was overrated. When their castles fell into debt, they turned to robbery, extorting merchants and ransoming travelers. It was basically aristocratic highway robbery, performed in armor and with the smugness of inherited titles. The empire spent centuries trying to stamp them out. Emperor Frederick III even issued decrees declaring that robber knights are no knights at all. Which, naturally, they ignored. After all, when you're broke, heavily armed, and bored, raiding caravans probably seems more exciting than etiquette. But the most curious criminals weren't the thieves or pirates, they were the forgers. Forgery was an art. Coins, seals, letters of privilege, anything that could be faked, was. Some monks forged documents granting their abbeys extra land. Some clerks forged pardons to free friends from prison. One German scribe even forged a letter claiming divine exemption from taxes, complete with the signature of St. Peter. The punishment for forgery was severe, usually mutilation, sometimes death. Yet it persisted. Because in an age obsessed with paperwork, ink was often mightier than the sword. As the centuries passed, justice slowly professionalized. Courts, sheriffs, and juries emerged. But for much of the Middle Ages, justice was still a spectacle. Trials by fire or water were common, the infamous ordeals. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, guilty. Simple. Elegant. Utterly absurd. The logic was that God would reveal the truth through nature. In practice, it was a coin toss with better outfits. By now, you might notice something. Medieval crime wasn't about evil in the modern sense. It was about survival, arrogance, and sometimes, sheer boredom. Nobles killed for pride. Peasants stole for bread. Pirates hunted because it paid better than prayer. Every thief and murderer, in their own strange way, mirrored their society. And as the night deepens, and the candle burns low, we might realize that crime, even in the Middle Ages, was just another way to be human. Flawed, foolish, and sometimes, fatally ambitious. Let's drift, now, to another kind of criminal, the ones who didn't steal or kill, but who challenged authority itself. Heretics, rebels, and the unfortunate souls who said the wrong thing to the wrong bishop. Because in the medieval world, sometimes the worst crime of all was simply thinking out loud. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, we're going to stay in the Middle Ages, but we'll leave the muddy roads behind for something a little more abstract, and, somehow, even riskier. Tonight, we're talking about heresy. The crime of having ideas. It's easy, from our comfortable distance, to think of the medieval church as a single, immovable monolith, candles, Latin chants, and absolute authority. But in truth, medieval faith was full of cracks. Every so often, a bright mind or a desperate soul would slip through one of those cracks and ask an awkward question. Something like, Does the priest really need to be rich, or should the Pope actually be a warrior? And just like that, they'd be branded a heretic. The word itself, heresy, comes from the Greek for choice. To choose differently. Which, in the Middle Ages, was basically treason against heaven. Let's start with one of the earliest and most famous, the Cathars of southern France. They called themselves the Pure Ones. Which, you'll agree, already sounds suspicious. They believed the world was a battle between good and evil, light and dark, spirit and matter. Physical things, they said, were the work of an evil god, while the soul belonged to the good one. This made them inconveniently moral. They refused to kill animals, avoided wealth, and practiced a kind of proto-vegan simplicity. Which would have been fine, except they also refused to obey the Pope. The Church tried persuasion. Then excommunication. Finally, they opted for something more decisive. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209, was less a war than a massacre. Entire towns were wiped out under the cheerful slogan, "Kill them all, God will know his own." It was the Church's way of reminding everyone that ideas could be fatal. Let's drift a little north, to England, and meet John Wycliffe, the university man with too many thoughts for his own safety. Wycliffe lived in the 14th century, when corruption in the Church was something of a spectator sport. Bishops collected gold while peasants starved. Popes fought wars. And the average Christian couldn't read the Bible, because it was in Latin. So Wycliffe did the unthinkable, he translated it. He wanted ordinary people to read scripture themselves, without clerical middlemen. It was revolutionary. And, naturally, illegal. Wycliffe was condemned, stripped of his post, and exiled from Oxford. But his followers, the Lollards, kept spreading his ideas. They met in barns, copied his translations by hand, and whispered sermons in English. After Wycliffe's death, the Church wasn't satisfied. They exhumed his body, burned his bones, and threw the ashes into the river Swift, because nothing says forgiveness like posthumous cremation. Across Europe, similar stories unfolded, thinkers, mystics, and the occasional unfortunate philosopher. In Bohemia, there was Jan Hus, a priest who admired Wycliffe and thought maybe the Church should stop selling indulgences like raffle tickets. He spoke too clearly, too publicly, and too often. In 1415, Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance under promise of safe conduct. Which, as it turned out, meant safe until you arrive. He was burned at the stake, singing psalms until the end. Centuries later, his followers, the Hussites, rose up in rebellion, armed with flails and wagon fortresses, because nothing says faith like weaponized farming tools. But not all heretics were solemn reformers. Some were just eccentrics. Take Fra Dalsino, an Italian preacher from the early 1300s. He led a group called the Apostolic Brethren, who believed in radical poverty, and, apparently, mountain living. When the Church excommunicated them, they simply retreated into the Alps. There, they survived for years, raiding villages, preaching equality, and freezing to death in spectacular numbers. Eventually, the Pope sent troops to deal with them. Dalsino was captured, tortured, and executed. But his legend lingered, a half-saint, half-bandit figure who refused to obey anyone but God. Inquisitors, those grim administrators of truth, soon became experts in rooting out heresy. They were trained in logic, interrogation, and paperwork, lots of paperwork. The Inquisition wasn't actually a single organization at first, it was more like a traveling franchise of fear. They'd arrive in a town, set up shop, and invite anyone with suspicious neighbors to confess. People did. Often about other people. In some regions, confessing the heresy was safer than being accused of hiding one. It was, in effect, the first bureaucratic nightmare, complete with seals, ink, and quietly ruined lives. But heresy wasn't the only way to fall foul of medieval law. There were also the rebels, those who thought the king himself might be mistaken. Let's drift toward 1381, England again, during the Peasants' Revolt. It began with taxes, doesn't everything? The government imposed a poll tax, charging every adult the same amount, rich or poor. For peasants still recovering from the Black Death, it was the final insult. They rose up, led by a man named Wat Tyler, and marched on London. Their demands were surprisingly reasonable: fair wages, freedom for serfs, and an end to corrupt officials. For a brief, astonishing moment, they succeeded. The teenage King Richard II even met them in person and agreed to reforms. Then, naturally, the moment ended. Tyler was killed during negotiations, and the revolt was crushed. The surviving peasants were told to go home and never think such thoughts again. Most of them did, outwardly. But the idea of rebellion had taken root. It would bloom again and again, century after century, like a stubborn weed in royal soil. Further north, in Scotland, rebellion took on a slightly different tone. There, it was practically a national pastime. Figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce weren't technically criminals, depending on who was writing the history. To the English, they were traitors. To the Scots, heroes. Wallace, as you know, met a particularly unpleasant end in London. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, the full medieval hospitality package. His only crime, from his point of view, was refusing to accept that England owned Scotland. It's a reminder that in medieval Europe, crime was often just another word for inconvenient. Let's pause here, breathe in the candlelight for a moment. The Middle Ages punished thieves and killers harshly, yes, but it reserved its deepest fury for those who thought too much. Whether it was a monk translating scripture, a peasant demanding justice, or a philosopher wondering aloud, what if the Pope is wrong? These were the minds that frightened kings and priests the most. Because ideas spread. And unlike bandits, you couldn't hang an idea. Still, for every heretic burned, two more seemed to appear. The Middle Ages were nothing if not persistent. And as the centuries drifted on, the line between saint and sinner blurred. A heretic of one century could become the reformer of the next. Perhaps that's the most medieval irony of all, that those condemned for heresy were often the ones history later called brave. Now, let's drift even deeper into the night, and into a different kind of criminal. The royal criminals, kings and queens who broke their own laws, betrayed their own families, and sometimes lost everything for it. Because, as history loves to remind us, crowns don't make anyone wiser. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, let's stay very still for this next part. We're moving from the dusty execution squares to the royal chambers, where crimes weren't shouted, but whispered. It's time to meet the monarchs who made the laws, and then immediately broke them. We'll begin with King John of England, a man who managed to annoy almost everyone in his lifetime, and several people after it. John was the youngest son of Henry II, and not really supposed to rule anything. His older brothers were stronger, braver, and, tragically for them, short-lived. By the time John inherited the throne in 1199, most of his family had either died or killed each other. He was left with a kingdom, a crown, and a personality entirely unsuited for both. John had a knack for failure that bordered on art. He lost nearly all of England's French lands, alienated his nobles, and taxed his subjects into open revolt. But his real crime wasn't incompetence, it was greed. John loved money the way dragons love gold. He fined barons for imaginary offenses, seized estates, and sold justice to the highest bidder. If you wanted a fair trial in John's England, you needed two things: innocence and a very heavy purse. His temper was legendary. Chroniclers described him gnawing on his own fingers when angry, possibly because everyone else had already fled the room. Eventually, his nobles had enough. They forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that basically said, "You're still king, but please stop being awful." John, naturally, ignored it. Within months, he was back at war with his barons. He died not in battle, but in a more poetic fashion, during a campaign, after eating an excessive amount of peaches and cider. The chroniclers called it a surfeit. Modern historians might call it food poisoning. Either way, it felt like the universe making a point. Let's drift a bit north, to Scotland again. There, in the early 15th century, ruled King James I of Scotland, a man whose reign was equal parts poetry and paranoia. James was clever. Too clever, really, for medieval politics. He'd spent years as a prisoner in England, where he learned about law, governance, and, apparently, how to make everyone hate him. When he finally returned to Scotland and took the throne, he decided to reform the nobility. which meant executing quite a few of them. He accused them of treason, confiscated their lands, and filled his court with spies. He even wrote poetry about how misunderstood he was, because naturally, he did. Eventually, his nobles decided enough was enough. One night in 1437, a group of assassins broke into his chamber at Perth. James tried to escape through a tunnel, but in a twist worthy of legend, he'd recently ordered that very tunnel sealed off to stop tennis balls from getting lost in it. And that's how the King of Scotland was cornered and killed, because of a plumbing renovation. Now, if you're thinking, well, surely England learned from that. No, it didn't. Next up, Edward II, possibly the most unfortunate king England ever produced. Edward was the son of the mighty Edward I, conqueror of Wales, builder of castles, and all-around overachiever. His son, by contrast, preferred farming. Literally. Edward II loved digging ditches, rowing boats, and hanging out with common laborers. His favorite companion was a man named Piers Gaveston, a charismatic noble with impeccable taste in clothes and a dangerous lack of tact. The nobles despised Gaveston. Edward adored him. He showered him with titles, wealth, and, most unforgivably, attention. When the nobles exiled Gaveston, Edward brought him back. When they exiled him again, Edward threw a royal tantrum. Eventually, they captured Gaveston and executed him. Edward reportedly wept for days. He soon found another favorite, Hugh Despenser, and repeated the entire process, only worse. This time, the barons rebelled outright. In 1327, Edward was deposed by his own wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. He was imprisoned and, according to the most famous, and probably apocryphal, legend, murdered with a red-hot poker. Because medieval chroniclers had a flair for symbolism, and possibly for exaggeration. We can't talk about royal criminals without mentioning Richard III, England's last Plantagenet king and longtime villain of Shakespearean fame. Richard's reign was short, his spine allegedly crooked, and his reputation permanently bent by propaganda. He's most famous for the disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower. They were young, legitimate heirs to the throne, and very inconveniently alive. After Richard declared them illegitimate and took the crown, they vanished from the Tower of London. No bodies, no witnesses, no confessions. Some say Richard had them killed. Others say Henry VII did it later, to tidy up loose ends. Either way, the princes were gone, and Richard's name was forever blackened. He died at Bosworth Field in 1485, charging into battle while shouting, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." He got neither horse nor kingdom. 5 centuries later, his skeleton was found under a car park in Leicester. Which is, admittedly, a very English way to end a mystery. But let's drift farther east, into the opulent but equally treacherous courts of France. Here we meet Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. A misleading nickname, since his beauty did not extend to his temperament. Philip was the sort of man who could weaponize paperwork. He used law like a cudgel, crushing anyone who stood in his way, including, famously, the Knights Templar. The Templars were rich, disciplined, and suspiciously independent, 3 qualities monarchs traditionally dislike in other people. In 1307, Philip had every Templar in France arrested on the same day, accusing them of heresy, devil worship, and various indecencies. Torture did the rest. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake. According to legend, as he died, he cursed Philip and the Pope to join him within a year. They both did. Coincidence, of course. But an entertaining one. Philip's reign left France stronger, richer, and cursed, or so people said. His sons all died young and childless, sparking the 100 Years' War. So, in a sense, his greatest crime was excellent long-term storytelling. Not to be outdone, Spain offered up Peter of Castile, called Peter the Cruel. Though, to be fair, some called him Peter the Just, depending on whether you survived him. Peter came to power in 1350 and immediately began purging anyone he didn't trust, which turned out to be almost everyone. He executed relatives, nobles, and a few unlucky servants. He even had his half-brother's mistress roasted alive. Yes, roasted. but the story takes an oddly poetic turn. That same half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, rose up against him. The two met in battle, then again in a private duel. According to chroniclers, Peter was winning until Henry's allies stabbed him in the back, literally. As Peter lay dying, Henry declared himself king. And history, perhaps out of sheer exhaustion, agreed. Now, if you're still awake, and I suspect some of you aren't, let's drift quietly toward France again, and meet Charles VI, sometimes called Charles the Mad. He wasn't criminal in the usual sense, no assassinations, no coups, just tragically unwell. Charles began his reign with promise, handsome, intelligent, beloved by his people. Then, one hot summer day in 1392, he had a breakdown. He was riding with his army when, suddenly, he turned on his own men, screaming that they were traitors, and began attacking them. When he woke from his frenzy, he didn't remember a thing. From then on, his sanity came and went like the seasons. At times, he believed he was made of glass. He refused to be touched and had iron rods sewn into his clothes to prevent shattering. Meanwhile, France fell apart. His wife and uncles ruled through scheming factions, and the English invaded during his reign's confusion. Charles lived for decades in this tragic fog, while his kingdom burned around him. He died quietly in 1422, his crown intact, but his mind long gone. And perhaps that's the theme running through all these royal criminals. Some were greedy, some cruel, some simply broken. But all of them were prisoners of their own power, living in golden cages, surrounded by flatterers and fear. They could steal, kill, or destroy with impunity. But they could never quite escape themselves. We'll drift onward soon, into the quieter corners of medieval life, the criminal underworld of beggars, alchemists, and wandering tricksters. But for now, let's pause in these ruined palaces, where kings broke their own laws and queens whispered their guilt into silk pillows. Even in history's deepest luxury, crime has a way of finding company. Hey everyone, still with me? Good. Tonight, we're drifting down from the marble halls of monarchs to the muddy streets below, where history's other characters lurked. Because while kings broke laws from thrones, ordinary people broke them for bread. And in the medieval world, that was often the same thing. Picture a city like London in the 14th century. Not the romanticized version, no charming markets or cobbled cafes. Just filth. The streets were narrow, dark, and crowded, with open drains running down the middle. The air was thick with wood smoke, tanneries, and something that might have once been fish. In this maze of smells and shadows, thieves thrived. Not because they were clever, necessarily, but because survival demanded it. There were cut purses, the specialists of the market crowd, who could slice your coin purse from your belt faster than you could say God's teeth. And there were footpads, who preferred the quiet work of nighttime ambushes. Pickpocketing was considered a high art in medieval London. Apprentices trained for it, usually by cutting buttons off dummies or fruit from hanging ropes. If they could do it without making the fruit swing, they were ready for the streets. Of course, crime had consequences. Caught thieves could expect a variety of creative punishments. Branding, whipping, ear cropping, or, if the judge was feeling particularly moralistic, hanging. But sometimes, the punishment was surprisingly lenient. Judges knew that public executions were expensive and messy. So, minor thieves were often sent to church for penance, essentially, a medieval timeout with added guilt. Now, some thieves didn't stop at pickpocketing. Some aimed higher, literally. Roofmen, as they were called, broke into homes by climbing in through the upper windows or tearing up roof tiles. They preferred moonless nights and distracted guards. If caught, they claimed divine inspiration. The Lord led me to the silver plate, which, admittedly, was not a legal defense that aged well. But the underworld wasn't just thieves. It was also full of performers, hustlers, and the wonderfully medieval profession known as the pardoner. Pardoners were church agents who sold forgiveness, yes, actual forgiveness, for cash. For a small fee, you could shave years off your time in purgatory. For a large one, you could apparently skip it altogether. Of course, some pardoners took this a little too far. They forged papal documents, invented relics, and toured villages with jars allegedly containing the Virgin Mary's milk. Which, by the 14th century, had reached improbable quantities. Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, immortalized one such character, the pardoner who preached about greed while his own bags jingled with silver. It was hypocrisy as performance art, and the crowds loved it. Another shadowy profession was that of the alchemist. Not quite a scientist, not quite a magician, the alchemist lived in that hazy borderland between belief and chemistry. Their dream was simple: turn base metal into gold. Their results were mostly disappointing. Yet alchemists kept busy. They mixed mercury with sulfur, boiled lead, and filled the air with mysterious vapors. Some worked for kings, who were more than happy to fund the search for eternal wealth, so long as someone else inhaled the fumes. Every so often, an alchemist claimed success, usually just before fleeing town with their patron's money. Still, the idea of transmutation refused to die. Because, in a world ruled by superstition and hope, maybe gold could be coaxed from dust. And maybe mortality wasn't quite permanent. It was comforting, in a way. A reminder that even fraud can be a form of optimism. Of course, not every medieval criminal operated alone. Some formed loose networks, the closest thing the era had to organized crime. In England, one of the more infamous groups was called the concubines. They were basically medieval con artists with flair. They developed their own slang, dressed like merchants or friars, and used coded language to spot fellow tricksters in a crowd. A nod here, a phrase there, and you knew you were among friends, or at least, partners in deception. They robbed travelers, forged documents, and occasionally worked as mercenaries when business was slow. By the mid-15th century, the French authorities decided they'd had enough. The concubines were rounded up, interrogated, and, predictably, executed. But their slang survived, drifting through the years until later thieves can't. Even in death, they left a linguistic fingerprint. Let's drift farther east now, toward the Holy Roman Empire, where the line between rogue and revolutionary blurred beautifully. There, we meet a peculiar figure named Gets von Berlichingen, a knight who could be described as half outlaw, half public relations expert. He spent most of his career feuding with neighbors, robbing merchants, and generally behaving like a man allergic to peace treaties. After losing his right hand in battle, he had a mechanical one built of iron, essentially a 16th century prosthetic fist. He could hold reins, wield a sword, even sign documents with it. The Germans called him Getz of the Iron Hand, which, you have to admit, sounds cooler than Getz, feudal nuisance. He eventually wrote his memoirs, a very early attempt at self-branding, where he portrayed himself as a wronged hero rather than a professional menace. He died comfortably in bed, proving that sometimes, good marketing outlasts bad behavior. And then there were the highwaymen, the romanticized robbers of later centuries, but with very unromantic hygiene. Medieval highwaymen haunted the roads between cities, where forests offered both cover and escape. They didn't always rob for riches. Many were displaced soldiers, victims of bad harvests, or people who'd simply given up on waiting for divine justice. The church, of course, condemned them. But travelers often sympathized, especially when the alternative was paying a king's tax collector instead. In a strange way, the bandit became a folk hero, a figure who broke unjust rules in a world already broken. And speaking of unjust rules, we can't ignore the medieval obsession with witchcraft. For much of the early Middle Ages, the church didn't actually believe witches existed. Then, quite suddenly, it decided they did, and that they were absolutely everywhere. Women, usually old, poor, or just inconvenient, found themselves accused of consorting with demons, spoiling crops, or flying through the night. The trials were theatrical, the evidence non-existent, and the confessions extracted through methods best described as unhelpfully persuasive. Witchcraft trials gave communities an outlet for fear and frustration. When the harvest failed or the plague returned, someone had to be blamed. And so the underworld expanded, not just thieves and alchemists now, but anyone who made others uncomfortable. It's dark, yes. But it also reveals something oddly human, the need to explain misfortune, to point at someone and say, there. That's why. By the late Middle Ages, the boundaries between sinner, criminal, and heretic had blurred entirely. The poor stole to live. The clergy sold forgiveness. The rich broke every rule they wrote. It was a world of contradictions, where a man could be hanged for stealing bread, while a noble could burn a village and still be considered misunderstood. And through it all, the underworld kept humming quietly beneath the surface. It was history's background noise. The rustle of a stolen purse. The whisper of an alchemist's flame. The shuffle of a partner counting coins in the dark. So, as we drift toward the end of this little midnight journey, imagine those shadowed figures walking the alleys, their lives lost to time. They were thieves, yes. But they were also survivors, storytellers, and, sometimes, the only honest people in a dishonest age. Because, really, what is crime but a reflection of the system that defines it? Hey everyone, if you're still awake, you might want to pull the blanket a little tighter. Tonight, we're drifting back to the mid-14th century, to one of the strangest and bleakest moments in human history, the Black Death. It wasn't just a disease. It was a slow undoing of everything people thought was permanent: faith, family, justice, and even decency. And in its wake, the old rules stopped making sense. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347, likely through trade ships from the east. Within months, it had spread like spilled ink, seeping into cities, towns, and monasteries. The symptoms were brutal: swollen buboes under the arms, blackened skin, fever, and delirium. But the strangest part was how fast it all happened. You could be healthy in the morning, fever by noon, and gone by sundown. Doctors had theories, of course. Bad air. Planetary alignment. God's wrath. Mostly, they wore bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, as if thyme and vinegar could stop death itself. Spoiler, they couldn't. As the death toll rose, cities changed in ways both awful and oddly fascinating. The streets were littered with the dead. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. Priests ran out of prayers. And the law, well, the law stopped mattering. When half your town is dying, you don't really care about paying taxes or following curfew. You just care about finding food and staying alive. Merchants looted the homes of their neighbors. Servants vanished with their master's silver. Even monks were caught raiding wine cellars, under the holy pretense of disinfection. There were too many crimes for anyone to bother counting. But the most fascinating criminals of the plague era weren't the thieves. They were the flagellants. These were bands of wandering penitents who believed the plague was punishment from God, and that salvation could only come through suffering. They marched from town to town, chanting hymns, beating themselves with whips tipped in iron, and begging forgiveness for humanity's sins. It sounds noble. It wasn't. They became a kind of traveling spectacle, a mixture of religious mania and carnival theater. Crowds followed them, hoping to find protection from the plague. But, naturally, they made things worse. Everywhere they went, panic followed. And, predictably, so did violence. The flatulence began accusing Jews of causing the plague by poisoning wells, a lie that spread faster than the disease itself. Entire communities were massacred. And the flatulence, in their self-proclaimed holiness, became something far more dangerous than criminals. They became convinced. Eventually, even the church condemned them, declaring that God did not ask for blood drawn by whips. But by then, the damage was done. Elsewhere, life continued in strange half-rhythms. In Italy, when the plague first struck Florence, the wealthy simply left. They fled to their villas in the countryside, leaving the poor to die behind the city walls. One group of survivors, hiding in the hills, passed the time by telling stories, 100 tales of love, folly, and revenge. Their names are long forgotten, but the book they inspired, the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, remains one of the most vivid portraits of plague-era escapism ever written. A group of people hiding from death by talking about life. A very human kind of rebellion. Meanwhile, in England, entire villages vanished. Fields went untilled. Mills stopped turning. The labor shortage was so severe that wages actually rose, a shocking development for the ruling class, who reacted in the only way they knew, by outlawing it. In 1351, the English crown passed the Statute of Labourers, which declared that no worker could demand higher pay than before the plague. It was, essentially, illegal to improve your circumstances. Naturally, people ignored it. Farmhands walked off estates, craftsmen moved to better towns, and a few bold individuals began calling themselves free men, a phrase that must have sounded intoxicating after centuries of servitude. The nobility was horrified. They called it lawlessness. But really, it was just the first stirrings of self-worth. And then came the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. It started, as revolts often do, with taxes. Specifically, a poll tax meant to pay for wars in France. But the anger behind it ran deeper, decades of unfair laws, serfdom, and broken promises. When officials tried to collect the tax in Essex, the villagers refused. Then the next village refused. Then London. Tens of thousands of peasants and townsfolk marched on the capital under the banner of a man named Wat Tyler. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair wages, and, somewhat optimistically, a conversation with the king himself. King Richard II, who was only 14, agreed. He met them outside London's walls, made polite promises, and smiled beautifully for history. Then, once the crowd dispersed, he ordered the leaders executed. Tyler was stabbed during the meeting, his body dragged through the streets as a warning. The revolt collapsed. But the idea that ordinary people could demand fairness survived. The plague years didn't just kill people, they killed certainty. After watching neighbors die overnight, people began questioning everything: divine justice, government, even the meaning of wealth. Church attendance dropped. Superstition rose. And new movements began to form, ones that would later grow into the Renaissance, Reformation, and all the other bright-sounding revolutions that began in darkness. Because, as history tends to prove, collapse often clears the ground for creation. But not everyone found enlightenment. Some just found opportunity. When death becomes routine, morality gets flexible. Grave robbers, for example, thrived. They stole rings, clothing, and even teeth from corpses. Doctors paid good money for plague victims' remains, convinced they could distill cures from the dead. Merchants hoarded grain, sold fake plague cures, and charged triple for garlic, because it was rumored to ward off infection. There were entire markets dedicated to holy charms said to repel the pestilence. One was simply a dead toad sewn inside a pouch. Surprisingly, it didn't work. By the early 15th century, Europe had survived several waves of plague. The population was smaller, the cities quieter, and the world, strangely, changed. Old feudal systems began to crack. The value of labor rose. And crime, which had once been punished by public execution, started to be viewed with something new: curiosity. Writers began to see thieves and rogues as complex characters rather than simple sinners. You can see it in the growing fascination with tales like Robin Hood, the outlaw who steals from the rich and gives to the poor. A folk hero born from the ashes of social collapse. It wasn't about whether he existed. It was about what people needed to believe. That justice might still be found in the shadows, even when the light had failed. So, as the bells fade and the city sleeps, imagine that world. Half-empty villages. Abandoned churches. Thieves and monks sharing the same silence. The plague didn't just kill millions. It reminded everyone that kings and beggars alike could fall to the same invisible hand. And in that strange equality of death, something new began to stir, a quiet, uneasy sense that maybe the old world was over.